What kind of survival movie is this that could make a working stiff, who usually finds his parents nagging annoying, pick up the phone in the theater restroom right after the credits rolled, and call his mom in tears? Some people have even kicked their habit of leaving without a word, now checking in with the family chat group even when they just go downstairs to pick up takeout. But in my view, the reason this movie pierces through adults' facade of strength so precisely is not because it depicts the wilderness's desperation with such graphic violence, but because it ruthlessly strips away our self-righteous sense of independence, proving that the bonds of family are the only reason to keep living. And that rebellious prodigal son, who hung up on his mother's call the moment he stepped out the door, how, in the desperate moment of drinking his own urine, did he weep uncontrollably, yearning for a simple home-cooked meal from his mother? Exactly what heartbreaking final words did he leave for the camera in that rock crevice, where no cry for help could be heard? And how, fueled by his desperate longing for his family, did he break his own bones to force a rebirth? Today let's tear away the mask of indifference, and watch this utterly heart-wrenching film. 127 hours, a man simply slips on a rock, and plummets headfirst into a crevice. To make matters worse, a massive boulder rolled down, and pinned his right hand in place. In that instant, excruciating pain shot through his entire body, nearly causing him to pass out. But more than the physical pain, what first flooded Alan's mind was sheer shock. This one-in-a-million event, like winning the lottery, had actually happened to him. He tried to lift it with his left hand, but the rock wouldn't budge. His instinct for survival drove him into a frantic struggle. He kicked it with all his might, rammed it with his back, and even threw his entire body weight into smashing against it. Yet, the boulder seemed to be embedded in the cliff face. Not an inch did it budge. After struggling with all his strength for nearly an hour, until his stamina was completely exhausted, he finally accepted this cruel reality. He began to shout for help, but the only response was the echo of the empty canyon. This was the middle of nowhere, not a soul in miles around. And to make matters worse, he hadn't brought his phone. Even if he had, it wouldn't have helped, because there was no signal in this godforsaken place. Worst of all, he hadn't told anyone his itinerary before leaving. This reckless behavior, as if he were courting death, had driven him to the very edge of the cliff. That's why failing to share your itinerary during outdoor adventures is a cardinal sin of extreme sports. The narrative here offers no moralizing whatsoever. Instead, it uses the harshest laws of physics to deliver a brutal safety lesson to all viewers. That rock is nothing less than punishment for human arrogance. He knew that to survive, he had to rely on himself, so he painstakingly dug out all his belongings to see if any tools could help him escape. But aside from some basic outdoor gear, the most crucial item was that roughly 500 milliliters of fresh water. But he had no idea how long it would last. He couldn't just sit and wait to die, so he decided to use his pocket knife to chisel away at the rock. But the stone was incredibly hard. He worked diligently for hours, his hands growing numb, yet he couldn't chip away even a single speck of rock. When it rains it pours. In a moment of inattention, his life-saving pocket knife fell into a crevice on the ground. He couldn't reach it at all. He took off his shoes and tried to pinch it with his toes, but he was always just a hair's breadth short. He calmed himself down and used his toes to pick up a small twig to hook it. Still no luck. Finally he snapped the twig in half and fashioned it into a small hook, and only then was he able to pull the knife up. Soon it was late at night. The temperature plummeted to 6 degrees Celsius. Exhausted and freezing, he was both weary and sleepy, but with half his body hanging in midair, sleep was impossible. So he tossed the rope loop upward dozens of times, until it finally caught on a protrusion in the rock. He secured it to his belt buckle, finally solving the problem of where to sleep. Yet the pain and cold were so intense that he'd jolt awake every 10 minutes. And so, through this endless torment, he finally endured until dawn. In this survival drama, though the protagonist, James, had no lines, relying solely on heavy breathing and moments of silence, not only did it not detract from the film's quality, but it allowed the audience to deeply feel the despair of being trapped in such a situation, while also magnifying humanity's insignificance and helplessness in the face of nature. After being trapped for 24 hours, the morning sunlight finally slanted into this desolate place. Alan reached his hand into the sunlight, greedily savoring nature's final gift. But when he looked down, he saw that his right hand, deprived of blood circulation for so long, had turned an unhealthy bluish gray. He knew deep down that this hand was completely ruined. Even if he were rescued now, it couldn't be saved. What was even more terrifying was that the cold night was descending once more. His body was rapidly losing heat due to malnutrition. He hurriedly wrapped everything he could find around himself for warmth, then unwrapped his only rations, chewing it in tiny bites. After finishing, he dared to drink only a tiny sip of water. He even carefully removed his contact lenses and held them in his mouth. Soon, by noon on the third day, Alan began his second attempt at self-rescue. He looped an elastic climbing rope around a rock, combining it with a carabiner and the rope above, to try to set up a fixed pulley system. This was a very clever approach, but reality poured cold water on his hopes. The climbing rope was too elastic, dissipating the force. Whether he pulled with all his might, or wrapped it around his feet and stomped furiously, the boulder didn't even budge. After all that effort, it was still a waste of energy. By then, severe dehydration had filled his mind with hallucinations. He finally couldn't resist. He opened the water bottle and took another small sip. Just then, a strong urge to urinate hit him. He quickly caught the urine in his water pouch, knowing that it might be the life-saving nectar he needed in the days ahead. The director's use of camera angles here is nothing short of masterful, cutting from sweeping wide shots to extreme close-ups, such as his parched lips and the dull blade of his knife. This contrast in perspective visually embodies the character's dwindling vitality and draws the audience deeper into the experience. As dusk fell that day, he addressed the DV camera with a summary. The pulley is useless, only 150 milliliters of water left. I can barely hold out until tomorrow night. But while organizing his gear, he discovered a cotton bag wrapped around the straw of the water pouch. It was the perfect tourniquet. Deep down he had long considered that one, and most brutal, way to escape. He had simply never dared to act on it, but now he had no other choice, so he gritted his teeth and wrapped the tourniquet tightly around his right hand, then used a carabiner to tighten it further. Finally he took out the small knife he'd used to chisel stone, and tried to cut into his arm. But the knife had become extremely dull from grinding stone. Even when he used all his strength, he couldn't even break through the outer layer of skin. Extreme weakness left him delirious. In a daze, he took a sip of water, but unfortunately knocked the water bottle over, wasting a large amount of precious water. This was the last straw. In a moment of utter despair, he simply gave up and fell asleep. Suddenly, lightning flashed and thunder roared in the canyon. A torrential downpour poured down. Alan was overjoyed. He opened the water bottle and frantically caught the rain, but because the rain was so heavy, it gradually swelled into a muddy flood, rushing back into the narrow canyon. The water level rose rapidly, surging over his head. Using the buoyancy beneath the water, he pushed the boulder with all his might. Miraculously the rock gave way. He was free again. He frantically rushed back to the car, and drove frantically all the way to his ex-girlfriend's house. He stood outside the window trying to win her back, but no matter how loudly he shouted, he couldn't make a single sound, and his girlfriend simply closed the door coldly. Alan woke up with a start, sobbing. No torrential rain, no flood, no rescue. He was still trapped in this nightmarish canyon. It turned out to be nothing but a dream, drinking urine, failed skin graft, experiencing near-death hallucinations. Here the script peels away layer by layer the character's self-respect and physical limits, revealing to the audience that once the veneer of civilized society is completely stripped away, just how much savagery life can unleash in the name of survival. Yet the visual contrast upon waking also pushes the sense of despair to its peak. As another sun rises, a tiny ant crawls across his body, pulling him back from the brink of nothingness. He knew the time had come. Today was Judgment Day. Since the knife cannot sever the bone, then I will snap it. He began to strain, exhausting the last ounce of strength remaining in his body, to frantically wrench his trapped right hand. Amid excruciating, heart-wrenching pain, with a crack, he snapped a bone in his arm. But he did not stop, for he knew that once he stopped he would never find the courage again. He continued to exert himself with frenzied force. The pain had surpassed the limits of human language. Finally, the second bone snapped as well. After completing this step, Alan let out a few maniacal laughs, wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes, pulled out the dull little knife, and began cutting into the flesh and nerves of his arm. This was the most terrifying and arduous part. He had to stay conscious, and use the blunt knife to gradually sever the sensitive nervous system. The excruciating pain shooting through his nerves left him unable even to scream. This self-dissection and struggle, as if the earth were splitting apart, lasted a full hour or more. Finally, amidst a mix of blood and sweat, he successfully severed his own arm. In that moment of regained freedom, he paused for a moment, as if none of it were real. Then, with extraordinary resolve, he bandaged his severed arm, and packed his belongings. But before leaving, he performed a gesture that commanded profound respect. He picked up his camera, and took a photo of the severed hand left forever in the crevice, bidding farewell to his former self. This sequence is the film's most intense and pivotal climax. James delivered the most realistic and harrowing portrayal of the idiom, cutting off one's own arm to save the body. For freedom, for his family, he was forced to pay with a fragment of his own body, as the steep price of his freedom. Though he had escaped the crevice, a new ordeal had only just begun, for the canyon was vast and boundless. There was nowhere to call for help. But what did it matter? Though he had lost an arm, he still had 2 feet. This was the chance at life he had traded for his severed limb. He staggered for hours under the scorching sun, dizzy and disoriented, stumbling and falling as he walked. Blood seeped constantly from the wound in his severed arm. He would get back up and keep moving forward. Finally, at the edge of his vision, he spotted a figure. He shouted with the last ounce of strength he had left. The others spotted him, and rushed toward him. He was saved.